They made me eat alone in the kitchen like some kind of servant, while the family I'd married into celebrated at the best table in the house. What they didn't know was that I secretly owned the entire restaurant chain, and their humiliation was about to cost them everything. My name is Diana Chen, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the people closest to you can be the most dangerous enemies of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Crystal Palace was supposed to be our celebration dinner. Marcus had just landed the promotion he'd been chasing for 3 years, and his entire family had insisted on gathering at the most expensive restaurant in the city to toast his success. I should have been happy for him. I should have been proud to sit beside my husband of 2 years as he basked in the admiration of his parents, siblings, and extended relatives. Instead, I found myself being ushered toward the kitchen entrance by my mother-in-law, Victoria Whitman, her perfectly manicured hand gripping my elbow with surprising force. "Diana, dear," she said in that syrupy voice that always made my skin crawl, "I've spoken with the manager, and they've arranged a lovely little table for you in the back. You'll be much more comfortable there, away from all the noise and commotion." The way she said comfortable made it clear this wasn't about my preference. It was about keeping me out of sight, away from the family photos that would inevitably be posted on social media, hidden from the view of anyone who might wonder why Marcus had married someone so beneath his social status. I looked toward my husband, hoping he would intervene, but Marcus was already deep in conversation with his father about investment portfolios and golf handicaps. He'd either not noticed what was happening or had chosen to ignore it. Given the pattern of the past 2 years, I suspected the latter. "Victoria," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think there's been some misunderstanding. I'd like to sit with my husband and his family." Her smile never wavered, but her eyes turned ice cold. "Oh, sweetie, I don't think that's appropriate tonight. This is a business celebration, and you wouldn't understand most of the conversation anyway. We'll be discussing things that are quite over your head." The insult was delivered with such practiced sweetness that anyone overhearing might have thought she was being considerate. But I heard the venom underneath, the same contempt she'd shown me since the day Marcus had introduced me as his girlfriend 3 years ago. Marcus's sister Jennifer appeared beside us, her designer dress probably worth more than I made in 6 months at the nonprofit where I worked. "Mom's right, Diana. Tonight is about family and business connections. You'd probably be bored to tears listening to us discuss Marcus's new position and the opportunities it opens up for all of us." The emphasis on all of us made it clear that I wasn't included in whatever those opportunities might be. I was an outsider, someone who had married into their world but would never truly belong to it. "Where exactly do you want me to sit?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. Victoria's smile brightened as if I'd asked the most delightful question. "There's a charming little spot in the kitchen area where the staff take their breaks. The manager assured me you'll have complete privacy there, and the kitchen staff will make sure you're well taken care of." She gestured toward a service door marked, "Staff only," as if she were directing me to a luxury suite, the kitchen. They wanted me to eat alone in the kitchen like some kind of servant while they celebrated at the best table in the house. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a mixture of humiliation and rage that I'd learned to swallow down over the past 2 years. "I see," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "And Marcus is fine with this arrangement?" Jennifer laughed, a tinkling sound that might have been pretty if it hadn't been so cruel. "Oh, Marcus suggested it actually. He said you'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed at large family gatherings and would prefer somewhere quiet." The lie was so smoothly delivered that for a moment I almost wondered if I had said something like that. But I knew I hadn't. This was just another example of how my husband allowed his family to rewrite reality to suit their narrative. As if summoned by our conversation, Marcus finally turned away from his father and approached us. His face showed mild annoyance, as if we were interrupting something important. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew what the problem was and considered it my fault. "Your mother has arranged for me to eat alone in the kitchen," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "She says it was your idea." Marcus glanced at his mother, and I saw something pass between them, a look of understanding that excluded me completely. Diana, we've talked about this. Large crowds make you anxious, and tonight is really important for my career. I thought you'd appreciate having some space to decompress. The gaslighting was so complete, so practiced, that I felt reality shifting around me. Had I complained about crowds? Had I said I preferred to be alone at family gatherings? The past 2 years had been filled with so many subtle manipulations that I sometimes doubted my own memories. Victoria placed a gentle hand on Marcus's arm, the picture of maternal concern. "We're just trying to be considerate of Diana's needs, darling. You know how she gets at these events, how I get." As if I were the problem. As if my discomfort at being constantly excluded and belittled was some kind of character flaw that needed to be managed. "Fine," I said, the fight going out of me. "I'll eat in the kitchen." The relief on their faces was immediate and unmistakable. This was what they'd wanted all along, what they'd been maneuvering towards since the moment we'd walked into the restaurant. Me, out of sight and out of mind, while they celebrated Marcus's success as if I didn't exist. The kitchen manager, a harried-looking woman named Rosa, led me through the service door and into the controlled chaos of the restaurant's heart. Chefs moved with practiced efficiency, servers rushed in and out with loaded trays, and the sound of sizzling pans created a constant background symphony. In the far corner, near a small window that looked out onto the alley behind the restaurant, sat a tiny table clearly intended for staff breaks. "I'm so sorry about this," Rosa said, her voice filled with genuine embarrassment. "Mrs. Whitman insisted, and she's one of our most important customers. She threatened to speak to the owner if we didn't accommodate her request." I settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair and managed a weak smile. "It's not your fault. I appreciate you finding me a spot." Rosa brought me a menu and a glass of water, her movements quick and efficient. "Order whatever you want." Mrs. Whitman said to put everything on her son's tab. At least they were paying for my exile, I thought bitterly. As I sat there listening to the sounds of the kitchen around me, I couldn't help but think about how I'd ended up in this situation. 2 years ago, I'd been Diana Chen, a successful nonprofit director with my own apartment, my own car, and my own life. I'd met Marcus at a charity gala, where his company was one of the major sponsors. He'd been charming, attentive, and seemingly impressed by my passion for the work I was doing with underprivileged children. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and romantic gestures that had swept me off my feet. When he proposed after 8 months, I'd said yes without hesitation, convinced that I'd found my happily ever after. It wasn't until after the wedding that I began to see the cracks in the fairy tale. Marcus's family had been polite during our engagement, but once the ring was on my finger, their true feelings became impossible to hide. I was Chinese American, the daughter of immigrants, who owned a...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Small restaurant in Chinatown. My parents had worked 16-hour days to put me through college, and I'd earned every scholarship and achievement through pure determination. But to the Whitmans, I was just another gold digger who had trapped their precious son into marriage. The fact that I'd actually earned more money than Marcus when we met seemed irrelevant to them. In their world, breeding mattered more than accomplishment, and I would never have the right bloodline no matter how successful I became. Marcus had started changing almost immediately after the honeymoon. The man who had once listened to my stories about work with genuine interest suddenly seemed bored by my career. He began making subtle suggestions that maybe I should consider finding something more suitable for a Whitman wife. When I resisted, he started undermining my confidence in small ways. He'd question my judgment on minor decisions, correct me in front of others, and gradually convince me that my instincts were wrong about nearly everything. The isolation had been gradual too. Marcus would schedule family events without consulting me, then act surprised when I couldn't attend due to work commitments. He'd make plans with his friends and forget to include me, then apologize so sincerely that I felt guilty for being upset. Slowly but surely, I found myself cut off from my own friends and family, dependent on Marcus and his relatives for social interaction. Tonight felt like the culmination of 2 years of systematic humiliation. As I sat in that kitchen, picking at a salad I'd ordered more out of politeness than hunger, I realized I'd lost myself completely. The confident woman who had once commanded boardrooms and inspired donors had been replaced by someone who accepted eating alone in a restaurant kitchen because her husband's family found her presence inconvenient. Through the small window beside my table, I could see into the main dining room, where the Whitman family celebration was in full swing. Marcus sat at the head of a long table, gesturing animatedly as he told some story that had everyone laughing. Victoria and her husband Richard flanked him like proud monarchs, while Jennifer and her husband David raised their glasses in what looked like an endless series of toasts. Other relatives I barely recognized filled out the rest of the table, all of them dressed in designer clothes and dripping with expensive jewelry. They looked happy, I realized. Happier than they'd looked in months. My absence wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. They could finally relax and be themselves without having to pretend they accepted me as part of the family. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless with the magnitude of my own self-deception. I'd spent 2 years trying to win their approval, modifying my behavior, suppressing my opinions, and diminishing myself in hopes that they would eventually accept me. But they never would, because they didn't want to. Rosa appeared at my table with a concerned expression. "How's everything? You've barely touched your food." I looked down at the expensive salad I'd been pushing around my plate and felt a wave of nausea. "I think I need some air," I said, standing up so quickly that my chair scraped against the floor. "Could you show me to the restroom?" She led me through a maze of corridors to a small employee bathroom that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. I locked the door behind me and stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. Her hair was styled in the conservative cut Victoria had suggested was more appropriate for charity events. Her dress was a muted beige that Victoria had helped her choose, saying it would help her blend in better at family gatherings. Even her makeup was subdued, neutral tones that wouldn't draw attention or make anyone uncomfortable. I'd become exactly what they wanted me to be: invisible, manageable, and forgettable. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. For the first time in 2 years, I could see my situation with perfect, crystalline focus. I was married to a man who didn't love me, surrounded by people who despised me, and living a life that belonged to someone else entirely. But there was something else, something I'd been hiding even from myself, for reasons I was only beginning to understand. As I stood in that dingy bathroom, listening to the muffled sounds of the kitchen beyond the door, I remembered a conversation I'd had with my lawyer 6 months ago. A conversation about a business acquisition that had been finalized in complete secrecy, hidden behind layers of shell companies and legal entities that no one could trace back to me. The Crystal Palace restaurant chain. All 15 locations, including this flagship establishment where I was currently eating alone in the kitchen like a servant. I owned it all, every table, every chair, every expensive bottle of wine that Victoria was probably ordering for her celebration. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that I almost laughed out loud. They'd chosen to humiliate me in the very restaurant I secretly owned, treating me like hired help in a business that belonged entirely to me. I'd bought the chain through a series of carefully structured deals, using money I'd inherited from my grandmother and investments I'd made long before meeting Marcus. The acquisition had been my secret project, something I'd worked on during the long evenings when Marcus was out with his friends or attending family events I wasn't invited to. My lawyer had advised me to keep the ownership hidden, suggesting it might be wise to have assets that my husband couldn't access or claim in case our marriage ran into trouble. At the time, I'd thought he was being overly cautious. Now, I realized he'd been protecting me from a situation I hadn't even known I was walking into. The Whitman family's wealth was largely illusion, I'd discovered through careful research. They lived well, but most of their assets were tied up in trust funds and real estate that generated more appearance than actual liquid income. Marcus's promotion tonight was probably more about desperation than success. A last-ditch attempt to maintain a lifestyle that was slowly becoming unsustainable. But they didn't know any of that about me. They saw what I'd allowed them to see. A non-profit worker who'd married above her station and was grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they chose to throw her way. They had no idea that the quiet, submissive woman they'd just banished to eat in the kitchen controlled every aspect of the establishment where they were celebrating. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for James Morrison, the management company that operated the Crystal Palace chain on my behalf. As the owner, I could make certain changes to the evening's arrangements, changes that would be implemented immediately and without question. My finger hovered over the call button as I considered what I was about to do. Once I made this call, there would be no going back. The careful facade I'd maintained for 2 years would crumble, and the consequences would ripple through every aspect of my life. But as I thought about Marcus laughing with his family while I sat alone in the kitchen, as I remembered 2 years of subtle humiliations and systematic isolation, I realized I didn't want to go back. The woman who had accepted this treatment was someone I no longer recognized or respected. She had been a creation of fear and desperation, a version of myself designed to please people who would never be satisfied no matter how much I sacrificed. I made the call. "James, it's Diana Chen. I need you to implement some changes at the flagship location tonight, effective immediately." His voice was crisp and professional, exactly what I needed right now. "Of course, Ms. Chen. What kind of changes are we talking about?" "There's a large party at table 12, the Whitman reservation. I want them moved to the smallest table available, preferably near the kitchen door, where the noise will be most intrusive. Tell them there's been a mix-up with their reservation and this is the only available seating." There was a brief pause before James responded. "Consider it done. Anything else?" "Yes. I want the most expensive items removed from their menu, and I want their wine list limited to house selections only. If they complain, tell them there's been a supply issue, and you're terribly sorry for the inconvenience." I could hear him taking notes, and I felt a surge of power I hadn't experienced in months. This was what it felt like to be in control, to make decisions that mattered, and have them implemented without question or negotiation. "Also," I continued, warming to the theme, "I want them to be served by your newest, most inexperienced server. Someone who might be prone to small accidents like spilling water or mixing up orders. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make their evening less pleasant than they'd hoped." James's voice carried a hint of amusement when he responded. "I believe I know exactly the person for that job. Will there be anything else, Miss Chen?" I thought about it for a moment, considering how far I wanted to push this. Then I remembered Victoria's expression when she'd directed me to the kitchen, the satisfied smile that had told me she was enjoying every moment of my humiliation. "One more thing. When their evening is winding down and they're ready to pay the check, I want you to personally inform them that their tab has been comped by the owner, but the gratuity for staff is not included. Make sure they understand that the owner felt their behavior toward one of the guests this evening was inappropriate and wanted to make amends." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for several seconds. When James finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "May I ask what prompted these specific requests, Ms. Chen?" I looked at myself in the cracked mirror again, seeing not the diminished woman I'd become, but glimpses of the person I used to be. "Let's just say I've had an educational evening about how some people treat others when they think no one important is watching." "Understood. The changes will be implemented within the next 15 minutes. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse, feeling lighter than I had in months. Whatever happened next, I would face it as myself, not as the apologetic shadow I'd allowed myself to become. The Diana Chen who had built a successful career and secretly acquired a restaurant chain was still there, buried under layers of self-doubt and people-pleasing behavior, but very much alive. When I returned to my table in the kitchen, Rosa was waiting with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right? You look different somehow." I managed my first genuine smile of the evening. "I think I'm going to be fine. Actually, I think I'm going to be better than fine." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded as if she recognized something she'd seen before. "Good for you. Sometimes it takes being pushed to the breaking point before we remember who we really are." Through the window, I could see the first signs that my instructions were being implemented. A server was approaching the Whitman table, gesturing apologetically toward a much smaller table near the kitchen door. Even from this distance, I could see Victoria's face turning red with indignation as she was forced to give up her prime seating. Marcus looked confused and embarrassed, clearly not understanding how such a mistake could have occurred at his celebratory dinner. The relocation process was chaotic and humiliating, exactly as I'd hoped it would be. The Whitmans had to gather their belongings, move their gifts and flowers, and settle into cramped seating that put them directly in the path of servers rushing in and out of the kitchen. The noise level at their new table was significantly higher, making conversation difficult and eliminating any possibility of the intimate family celebration they'd planned. I watched Marcus try to maintain his composure as he dealt with the seating disaster, his face cycling through confusion, frustration, and barely controlled anger. This was probably the first time in his life that things hadn't gone exactly as he'd expected, and he clearly had no idea how to handle the situation. Victoria was less restrained, gesturing dramatically and speaking in the sharp, authoritative tone she used when she expected immediate compliance with her demands. But the staff simply apologized and explained that this was the only available seating, offering minor compensations like free appetizers that only seemed to make the family more frustrated. Jennifer kept checking her phone, probably trying to figure out if this debacle would interfere with the social media posts she'd planned to document the evening. Her husband David looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle his in-laws were creating. The inexperienced server James had assigned to their table arrived to take drink orders, and I watched with satisfaction as she fumbled with her notepad and seemed confused by their requests. She spilled water while filling their glasses, mixed up who had ordered what, and generally created the kind of minor chaos that would transform an elegant celebration into an exercise in frustration management. From my vantage point in the kitchen, I had a perfect view of their increasing discomfort and irritation. Every small disaster that befell them felt like a small victory, a tiny piece of justice for 2 years of systematic humiliation and dismissal. They'd wanted me out of sight and out of mind, and now they were getting a taste of what it felt like to be powerless and ignored. But even as I savored their discomfort, I knew this was just the beginning. The real confrontation would come later, when they discovered exactly who had been orchestrating their evening of frustration. The thought both thrilled and terrified me, because once that truth came out, everything would change. My marriage, my relationship with Marcus's family, my entire life as I had known it for the past 2 years, would be over. The question was whether I was ready for that level of change, whether I had the strength to rebuild my life from scratch and face whatever consequences came from this evening's revelations. As I sat in that kitchen, watching the family that had never accepted me struggle with their own helplessness, I realized I didn't just want revenge. I wanted freedom, and I was finally ready to pay whatever price that freedom might cost. The chaos at the Whitman table was even more satisfying than I'd anticipated. From my strategic position in the kitchen, I watched as their elegant celebration devolved into a comedy of errors orchestrated entirely by my phone call. The inexperienced server I'd requested was a young woman named Bethany who seemed determined to break every piece of glassware within reach. She'd already knocked over 2 water glasses, delivered the wrong appetizers to 3 different people, and somehow managed to get Victoria's silk blouse splattered with olive oil from the bread service. Marcus kept glancing toward the kitchen door, probably wondering where I was and why I wasn't witnessing his public humiliation alongside the family. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was finally looking for me, but only because he needed someone to blame for the evening's disasters. I could see him making sharp gestures at the restaurant manager, his face flushed with the kind of anger he usually reserved for private moments when his mask slipped completely. Victoria had progressed from indignant to absolutely livid, her voice carrying across the dining room despite her attempts to maintain some semblance of class. She kept demanding to speak with the owner, apparently unaware that the owner was currently finishing a mediocre Caesar salad 30 feet away behind a kitchen door. The restaurant manager, a smooth professional named Thomas whom James had briefed on the situation, kept apologizing profusely while explaining that the owner was unavailable but would certainly want to make things right. Jennifer was frantically trying to salvage her social media documentation of the evening, but every photo she attempted was ruined by some new disaster. In one shot, Bethany's elbow was blocking Marcus's face. In another, her father-in-law was caught mid-complaint with his mouth hanging open unattractively. The carefully curated image she'd planned to project of a successful, sophisticated family celebration was crumbling as thoroughly as her mother's composure. I pulled out my phone and called James again, feeling a rush of power that I'd almost forgotten existed. This was what it felt like to be in control of my own destiny, to make decisions that mattered, without having to negotiate or apologize for taking up space in the world. "The changes are working perfectly," I told him when he answered. "But I want to add one more element to their evening." "What did you have in mind, Miss Chen?" His voice carried the hint of anticipation that I'd noticed earlier, as if he were enjoying this unconventional use of his services as much as I was. "I want you to send over your most knowledgeable sommelier, someone who can engage them in a detailed conversation about wine pairings and vintage years. Make sure he's particularly verbose and condescending, the type who assumes they don't know anything about wine and needs to educate them extensively." There was a pause before James responded, and I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. "We have exactly the person for that job. Philippe has been with us for 8 years and has very strong opinions about proper wine appreciation. He's also particularly sensitive about customers who he believes are ordering expensive wines just to show off rather than for genuine appreciation." "Perfect. And James, make sure Philippe knows that this particular table has been making disparaging comments about the restaurant's wine selection and questioning the authenticity of some of your vintage bottles. I think he'll find that information motivating." I ended the call and settled back to watch the next act of the evening's entertainment. Through the window, I could see Thomas approaching their table with a distinguished older man in tow. Philippe was exactly what I'd hoped for. Tall, severe, with the kind of precise mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously indeed. The sommelier's arrival at their table caused an immediate shift in dynamics. Victoria, who had been commanding attention through volume and indignation, suddenly found herself being lectured about the difference between terroir and vintage variation in Bordeaux wines. Philippe had apparently taken James's information about their supposed criticism of the wine selection as a personal challenge to his professional expertise. Marcus tried to interrupt the wine lecture to order something simple, but Philippe would have none of it. He launched into an extensive explanation of why the wine Marcus had chosen was completely inappropriate for the appetizers they'd ordered, despite the fact that Bethany had brought them the wrong appetizers to begin with. The circular logic of the situation was beautiful in its absurdity, trapping the family in a web of restaurant protocol they couldn't navigate or escape. Richard Whitman, Marcus's father, attempted to assert some authority by mentioning his membership at an exclusive country club with an award-winning wine cellar. Philippe responded by questioning whether Richard could properly identify a Burgundy from a Barolo in a blind tasting, then suggested that country club wine selections were typically chosen more for their price point than their quality. The insult was delivered with such smooth professionalism that Richard couldn't quite figure out how to respond without seeming petulant. The entire scene was more entertaining than anything I'd watched on television in months. These people who had spent 2 years making me feel small and insignificant were now experiencing their own version of powerlessness, trapped by social conventions and their own need to maintain appearances. They couldn't storm out without admitting defeat, but staying meant enduring continued humiliation in an increasingly public display. David, Jennifer's husband, kept checking his watch and making subtle gestures toward the exit that his wife was studiously ignoring. He was the only member of the family I'd ever felt sorry for, trapped in a marriage to someone who shared her mother's capacity for casual cruelty but lacked Victoria's strategic intelligence. Tonight, his discomfort was palpable, as he tried to minimize his association with the spectacle unfolding around him. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but when I opened it, I realized it was from Rosa, the kitchen manager who had been taking care of me. "Not sure what's happening out there, but that family who stuck you back here is having the worst dinner service I've ever witnessed. Karma's a beautiful thing." She'd included an emoji of laughing tears, and I found myself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. I typed back quickly. "Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things." Her response was immediate. "Girl, the universe had nothing to do with this. Someone with serious pull is making sure they suffer tonight, and whoever it is has my complete respect. They deserve every bit of what they're getting." Rosa was sharper than I'd given her credit for. already suspecting that the evening's disasters weren't entirely coincidental. But she didn't know the half of it yet. What she was witnessing was just the opening act of a much larger revelation that would reshape everything about how the Whitman family understood their place in the world. Through the kitchen window, I watched as Philippe finally concluded his wine lecture by recommending a bottle that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Victoria's face went through several interesting color changes as she processed the price, clearly torn between her desire to appear sophisticated and her practical instincts about spending money on what was already becoming a disastrous evening. Marcus made the decision for her, agreeing to Philippe's recommendation, with the kind of false confidence that suggested he had no idea what he'd just committed to paying for. The sommelier departed with obvious satisfaction, leaving the family to contemplate their rapidly escalating bill, and the realization that their evening was spiraling completely beyond their control. That's when Bethany returned with their entrees, and I watched in fascination as she managed to deliver every single dish to the wrong person. The vegetarian meal Jennifer had specifically requested ended up in front of her carnivorous father. Marcus's carefully ordered medium-rare steak was placed before Victoria, who had explicitly stated her preference for fish. The confusion that followed was spectacular, involving multiple attempts to redistribute the plates, while Bethany apologized with the kind of flustered incompetence that suggested she might be in the wrong profession entirely. I realized I was enjoying myself more than I had in months, possibly years. The woman who had once commanded boardroom negotiations and closed million-dollar deals was finally operating in her natural element again, orchestrating outcomes and watching her strategies unfold with precision. The submissive, apologetic version of myself that had emerged during my marriage felt like a costume I'd been wearing so long I'd forgotten it wasn't actually my skin. My phone rang again, and I saw James's number on the screen. "Miss Chen, I wanted to give you an update on the situation. Your guests are becoming increasingly agitated, and I'm concerned they might decide to leave before you've achieved whatever outcome you're hoping for tonight." I considered his concern carefully. He was right that there was a risk they might simply cut their losses and leave, which would rob me of the final confrontation I was beginning to realize I needed. "What do you suggest? Perhaps it's time to reveal your presence more directly." I could have Thomas mention that the owner is actually dining in the restaurant tonight and would like to meet with them personally to apologize for the evening's service issues. The suggestion sent a thrill of anticipation mixed with terror through my system. Once I revealed myself as the owner, there would be no taking it back. The careful facade I'd maintained for 2 years would shatter completely, and I'd have to face whatever consequences followed. But the alternative was to slink back to their table, apologize for my absence, and pretend that nothing had changed. The thought of returning to that dynamic, of going back to being the inconvenient wife who ate alone in kitchens while the real family celebrated, made me feel physically sick. "Do it," I told James. "But give me 5 minutes to prepare myself first." I ended the call and walked to the employee bathroom again, needing a moment to transform myself from the diminished woman I'd become back into the person I used to be. The reflection in the mirror still showed someone wearing clothes chosen to make her invisible, and a hairstyle designed to avoid drawing attention. But there was something different in my eyes now, a spark of determination and anger that had been missing for too long. I pulled the pins from my hair and shook it loose, letting it fall into the natural waves that Victoria had convinced me were too casual for family events. I rolled up the sleeves of my beige cardigan and unbuttoned the top button of my conservative blouse, small changes that somehow made me feel more like myself. Most importantly, I stood up straighter, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin with the confidence that had once been second nature to me. When I emerged from the bathroom, Rosa was waiting with an expression of concern mixed with curiosity. "Are you sure you're ready for whatever's about to happen out there? Because something big is definitely about to go down and you look like you're preparing for battle." I managed a smile that felt more genuine than any expression I'd worn in months. "I think I've been preparing for this battle for 2 years. I just didn't realize it until tonight." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded with approval. "Good. Sometimes we need to remind people who they're really dealing with. Whatever happens, remember that you deserve better than the way they've been treating you." Her words hit me with unexpected force, reminding me that there were people in the world who could see my worth even when I'd forgotten it myself. I walked back to my table in the corner of the kitchen, but instead of sitting down, I remained standing and pulled out my phone to call James one final time. "I'm ready. Have Thomas approach their table now and tell them the owner would like to meet with them. But don't tell them where I am yet. I want to make an entrance that they'll remember for the rest of their lives." The next few minutes felt like the longest of my life as I waited for Thomas to deliver the message and return with their response. Through the window, I could see him approaching their cramped table near the kitchen door, his expression appropriately grave as he delivered what I assumed was an apology for the evening's service failures along with the owner's request for a meeting. The family's reaction was immediate and predictable. Victoria straightened in her chair, clearly pleased that someone in authority was finally acknowledging the disasters they'd endured. Marcus looked relieved that there might be an opportunity to salvage something from the evening and perhaps even secure some sort of compensation for their troubles. Jennifer immediately began primping, apparently assuming that a meeting with a restaurant owner might provide new opportunities for social media content. Thomas gestured toward a private dining room at the far end of the restaurant, and I watched as the family gathered their belongings and began the trek across the main dining room. Other diners turned to watch their procession, probably wondering what kind of VIPs warranted a private meeting with management. The irony of their moment of perceived importance wasn't lost on me, knowing as I did that they were walking into the most humiliating encounter of their privileged lives. I gave them a few minutes to settle into the private dining room before making my own journey through the restaurant. But instead of taking the direct route they had used, I walked through the kitchen and emerged into the main dining room through the service door I'd been banished to earlier in the evening. The symbolism felt important somehow, a rejection of the invisibility they'd tried to impose on me. The walk across the restaurant felt like a march toward destiny. Other diners glanced up as I passed, probably wondering why a woman was emerging from the kitchen area dressed like a customer rather than staff. I could feel my confidence building with each step, the muscle memory of authority returning as I prepared to reclaim the power I'd given away over the past 2 years. When I reached the private dining room, I paused outside the door to listen to the conversation inside. Marcus was in full complaint mode, detailing every service failure and demanding explanations for the evening's disasters. Victoria was adding her own commentary about the unacceptable treatment they'd received as loyal customers. Jennifer was apparently taking photos of the elegant private dining room, narrating for her social media followers about the exclusive meeting they'd been granted. None of them mentioned my absence from their celebration or expressed any concern about where I might be. Even in their moment of crisis, I remained invisible to them, an afterthought who didn't warrant consideration or worry. The realization crystallized my resolve and eliminated the last traces of doubt about what I was preparing to do. I opened the door and stepped into the private dining room, watching as their faces cycled through confusion, recognition, and growing comprehension of what my presence meant. The silence that followed my entrance stretched for what felt like an eternity, heavy with implications that none of them quite understood yet. Thomas rose from his chair at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, as he prepared to deliver the revelation that would change everything. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, family members, I'd like you to meet the owner of Crystal Palace Restaurant Group. This is Ms. Diana Chen, who has some things she'd like to discuss with you about this evening's service." The shock on their faces was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. Marcus's mouth actually fell open, his brain apparently struggling to process how his invisible wife had suddenly become the powerful figure they'd been demanding to see. Victoria went completely pale, the implications of the evening's events finally beginning to penetrate her consciousness. Jennifer's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the table, her social media documentation forgotten in the face of this impossible revelation. But it was Richard's reaction that surprised me the most. Instead of shock or confusion, his face showed a calculating intelligence that I'd never seen before. He was the first to recover his composure, the first to begin thinking strategically about what this revelation meant for the family's position. "Diana," he said carefully, his voice neutral and cautious. "This is quite a surprise. Perhaps you could help us understand what's been happening here tonight." I remained standing while they all sat, the physical positioning reinforcing the power dynamic that had just been completely reversed. For 2 years, I'd been the one looking up at them from a position of social inferiority. Now they were literally looking up at me, waiting for explanations, and hoping for mercy they hadn't earned. "What's been happening," I said, my voice steady and clear, "is that you've been experiencing what it feels like to be powerless and dismissed by people who control your circumstances. You've been forced to accept seating you didn't want, served by staff who didn't seem to care about your comfort, and treated as if your preferences and dignity didn't matter." The words hung in the air between us, their meaning unmistakable. Marcus found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. "Diana, I don't understand. When did you buy this restaurant? How is this possible?" The bewilderment in his voice was genuine, a recognition that the woman he thought he knew had never existed at all. I'd been playing a role, becoming smaller and weaker to fit into their world, while my real self had been building an empire they never suspected. "I've owned this restaurant chain for 6 months," I replied calmly. "I purchased it using my own money, from my own investments, through my own business connections. The same business acumen that you've all spent 2 years dismissing as irrelevant to your sophisticated world." Victoria finally found her voice, though it was significantly less commanding than usual. "But why didn't you tell us? Why keep something like this a secret?" I looked at her for a long moment, remembering every small cruelty, every casual dismissal, every time she'd made me feel like an unwelcome intruder in my own marriage. Because I learned very quickly that this family doesn't value what I have to offer. You made it clear that my career, my achievements, and my capabilities were embarrassments to be minimized, rather than assets to be celebrated. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jennifer's nervous breathing and the distant clatter of dishes being cleared in the main dining room. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about tonight's dinner service. This was about 2 years of accumulated resentment and the systematic destruction of a woman's self-worth by people who should have been supporting her. Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ms. Chen, would you like me to leave you to have this conversation privately with your family?" The way he said family carried just enough emphasis to remind everyone in the room that these people who had been treating me like an outsider were supposed to be my closest relationships. "Actually, Thomas, I think it would be appropriate for you to stay. As the manager of this establishment, you should hear what I have to say about how certain customers have been treating other guests this evening." I turned back to face the Whitman family, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. They weren't the sophisticated, powerful people I'd tried so desperately to impress. They were just ordinary individuals who had convinced themselves that their breeding and social connections made them superior to everyone else. "You see," I continued, "earlier tonight this family decided that I wasn't worthy to sit at their table. They felt that my presence would somehow diminish their celebration, so they arranged to have me eat alone in the kitchen like hired help. They told me it was for my own comfort, but we all know what it really was." Marcus was starting to look sick, the implications of their behavior finally penetrating his consciousness. "Diana, we didn't mean it like that. Mom just thought—" "Your mother thought exactly what she meant to think," I interrupted, my voice sharp with 2 years of suppressed anger. "She thought that the woman her son married was an embarrassment, who needed to be hidden away when important people might be watching. And you, Marcus, went along with it because it was easier than standing up for your wife." The accusation hit its target, and I watched him flinch with the recognition of his own cowardice. Jennifer was frantically trying to process how this revelation would affect her social media presence, probably calculating whether being related to a restaurant owner was good for her image or not. David looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, finally understanding that he'd married into a family whose cruelty was about to have serious consequences. But it was Victoria's reaction that interested me most. The shock was wearing off, being replaced by a calculating look that told me she was already trying to figure out how to turn this situation to her advantage. She was probably wondering if my ownership of a successful restaurant chain might actually elevate the family's social status, whether she could spin this revelation into something that benefited her rather than exposed her behavior. "Diana, darling," she said, her voice taking on the sickeningly sweet tone she used when she wanted something. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding tonight. We never intended to hurt your feelings or make you feel unwelcome. We were just trying to give you some quiet space to relax, while we handled the business aspects of Marcus's celebration. The gaslighting was so immediate and complete that I almost admired her ability to rewrite reality in real time. There's been no misunderstanding, Victoria, I replied, maintaining the formal distance I'd never been allowed to breach in 2 years of trying to be accepted. You've made your feelings about me perfectly clear on multiple occasions. Tonight was just the most blatant example of treatment I've been receiving since the day I married your son. I turned to address Marcus directly, seeing him clearly for the first time since our wedding day. And you, Marcus, have allowed it to happen every single time. You've stood by while your family systematically destroyed my confidence and made me question my own worth. The truth hung between us like a physical barrier, impossible to deny or dismiss. 2 years of careful manipulation and emotional abuse were finally being called by their proper names. And the people responsible were being forced to confront the reality of what they'd done. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that he was witnessing the breakdown of a marriage in real time. But I was grateful for his presence, grateful that there was a witness to this conversation who wasn't invested in maintaining the family's version of events. The question now, I continued, is what we're going to do about it. Because things can't continue the way they have been. I won't be going back to eating in kitchens while you celebrate at the main table. I won't be hiding my achievements to make you feel more comfortable. And I won't be pretending that your behavior toward me has been acceptable. The words felt like they were coming from the Diana Chen who had existed before my marriage, the woman who had never learned to make herself small for other people's convenience. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his face pale but determined. Diana, let's go home and talk about this privately. We don't need to air our personal business in front of strangers. But I could see the calculation behind his apparent concern, the desire to get me alone where he could work on rebuilding the power dynamic that had just been shattered. Thomas isn't a stranger, I replied calmly. He's an employee of my business, and he's just witnessed how certain customers treat other guests in my establishment. I think he deserves to understand the full context of what he saw tonight. I turned to face Thomas directly. What this family did tonight, forcing one guest to eat alone in the kitchen while they occupied premium seating, is exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior that goes against everything this restaurant stands for. Thomas nodded slowly, beginning to understand his role in whatever was about to unfold. Of course, Ms. Chen. This establishment has always prided itself on treating all guests with equal respect and dignity. The formal language was perfect, creating an official record of the family's behavior that would be difficult to dispute later. Victoria was starting to look panicked, finally realizing that the situation was spinning beyond her ability to control or manipulate. Diana, surely we can resolve this as a family. There's no need to involve business matters in what's obviously a personal misunderstanding. But her appeal for family unity rang hollow after 2 years of making it clear that I would never be truly accepted as part of that family. You're right that this is personal, I agreed. It's personal in the way that all discrimination and abuse are personal to the people who experience them. But it's also about power, and about how people with power choose to treat those they perceive as powerless. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Tonight you learned what it feels like when that power dynamic shifts. The realization of what I'd done, what I'd been doing all evening while they struggled through their disastrous dinner, was finally beginning to penetrate their consciousness. The seating change, the incompetent service, the condescending sommelier, all of it had been orchestrated by the woman they'd dismissed as powerless and irrelevant. Richard spoke up for the first time since my revelation, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to negotiate from a weakened position. Diana, I think we all owe you an apology for tonight. Perhaps we can start over and handle this situation more appropriately. But his words felt calculated rather than genuine, an attempt to minimize damage rather than acknowledge wrongdoing. I studied his face, seeing the political instincts that had probably served him well in business but felt inadequate to the emotional reality of what had transpired. An apology would be a beginning, I said slowly. But it wouldn't address the fundamental problem, which is that this family has spent 2 years treating me as if my thoughts, feelings, and achievements don't matter. The silence stretched uncomfortably as they processed the magnitude of what I was saying. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. "Diana, I didn't realize we were making you feel that way. Maybe we could all try to do better going forward?" But her words carried the hollow ring of someone offering a solution to a problem she didn't really understand. "The time for trying to do better was 2 years ago," I replied, feeling the weight of accumulated disappointments and humiliations. Tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern of behavior that's been consistent since the day I joined this family. I paused, letting the implications sink in. "And now you know that the woman you've been treating as powerless and irrelevant actually controls something you value." The power shift was complete, and we all knew it. The people who had spent 2 years making me feel small and insignificant were now dependent on my goodwill for their comfort and social standing. The restaurant where they'd chosen to celebrate Marcus's success belonged entirely to me, and their behavior here tonight would follow them wherever I chose to take this story. Marcus was starting to understand the full scope of what he was facing, and I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of social consequences, fear of exposure, fear of losing the comfortable position he'd occupied at the center of a family that was about to be forced to reckon with its own cruelty. "What do you want from us, Diana?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time in 2 years that he'd asked me what I wanted, instead of telling me what I should want. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibilities and consequences that none of us could yet fully comprehend. Marcus's question lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and I realized that for the first time in our relationship he was genuinely asking what I wanted rather than assuming he already knew. The vulnerability in his voice was something I'd never heard before, stripped of the casual confidence that had always defined his interactions with me. But even as I registered this shift, I felt nothing resembling the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, there was a hollowness where my anger had been, as if orchestrating their humiliation had burned through something essential inside me. "What I want," I said slowly, testing each word as it formed, "is something that should have been freely given from the beginning. I want respect. I want to be seen as an equal partner in my own marriage instead of a burden to be managed." I paused, watching their faces process these apparently revolutionary concepts. I want my achievements to be celebrated instead of hidden. I want my opinions to matter in family decisions that affect me. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to show stress fractures around her eyes. "Diana, I think you're being a bit dramatic about this whole situation. Family dynamics take time to develop, and perhaps we could have communicated better, but..." Her attempt to minimize what had happened was so predictable that I almost laughed. Even now, facing the complete destruction of her carefully constructed narrative, she was trying to reframe my experience as an overreaction. "Stop," I said, my voice carrying an authority that surprised even me. "Stop rewriting what happened. Stop pretending that 2 years of systematic exclusion and belittlement was just poor communication. Stop acting like tonight was an isolated misunderstanding when it was actually the logical conclusion of how you've treated me since the day Marcus brought me home." The words came out harder than I'd intended, each one sharp with accumulated frustration. Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically, reminding us all of his presence. "Perhaps this would be a good time for me to arrange some privacy for your family discussion," he offered, but I shook my head. His presence felt like a lifeline, a neutral witness to conversations that might otherwise be denied or reinterpreted later. "I'd prefer you stay, Thomas. As I mentioned, you've witnessed how certain guests were treated in your establishment tonight, and I think the full context is important for your understanding of our policies regarding customer behavior." I turned back to face the family, seeing them with a clarity that felt almost painful. Because what happened tonight wasn't just personal cruelty. It was discrimination based on your perception of my worth relative to yours. Jennifer had been unusually quiet, but now she leaned forward with an expression that might have been genuine concern or calculated self-interest. "Diana, I had no idea you felt this way about family gatherings. Maybe we could establish some new traditions that include you more centrally." Her suggestion carried the tone of someone offering a compromise, as if my exclusion had been an oversight that could be corrected with better planning. "The problem isn't the seating arrangements at dinner parties," I replied, feeling exhausted by their continued failure to grasp the fundamental issue. "The problem is that you all decided, collectively and individually, that I wasn't worth including in the first place." Tonight was just the most visible example of an attitude that's been consistent from the beginning. Richard had been calculating since my revelation, and now I could see him working through the implications of having a restaurant owner in the family. His business instincts were probably telling him that this could be advantageous if handled correctly, but his social prejudices were warring with his practical interests. "Diana, setting aside tonight's unfortunate events, perhaps we should discuss how your business ownership might benefit the entire family. There could be opportunities for collaboration, for expanding your operations." His immediate pivot to potential profit was so perfectly Richard that I felt a grim sort of admiration for his consistency. Even in the middle of a family crisis, his first instinct was to identify revenue streams and networking possibilities. The man who had barely spoken to me in 2 years was suddenly interested in collaboration, now that I controlled something valuable. "My business decisions aren't going to be made based on family considerations," I said firmly. "This company was built without any help or input from the Whitman family, and it will continue to operate independently of your interests or opinions." The finality in my voice seemed to surprise him, as if he'd expected me to be flattered by his sudden attention to my professional capabilities. Marcus was staring at his hands, apparently lost in thoughts I couldn't read. When he finally looked up, his expression was unrecognizable, showing neither the casual dismissiveness I'd grown accustomed to, nor the panic I'd seen earlier. Instead, there was something that might have been genuine regret, though I'd learned not to trust my interpretations of his emotions. "Diana," he said quietly, "I think I'm beginning to understand how badly I've failed as a husband. Not just tonight, but for a long time. I let my family treat you poorly, because it was easier than confronting them, and I convinced myself that you were fine with it because you never fought back." His admission was more honest than anything he'd said to me in months, but it also revealed the fundamental flaw in his thinking. "I never fought back because I was trying to save my marriage," I replied, feeling the weight of that failed effort. "I thought if I could just be agreeable enough, quiet enough, undemanding enough, eventually your family would accept me, and you would see that I was worth defending." The naivete of my former self felt almost embarrassing now. The desperate optimism of a woman who had believed love could overcome systematic contempt. "But you were never going to defend me, were you?" I continued, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. "Because defending me would have required you to acknowledge that your family was wrong, and that would have disrupted the comfortable dynamic you'd grown up with. It was easier to let me absorb their hostility than to challenge the system that benefited you." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted my earlier revelations. This was the heavy silence of people confronting truths they'd successfully avoided for years. Truths that couldn't be dismissed or reframed once they'd been spoken aloud. Victoria broke the silence with what sounded like genuine desperation. "Diana, you're talking about our family as if we're monsters, but we're not. We're just people who maybe haven't been as welcoming as we should have been. Surely we can find a way to move forward that doesn't involve destroying everything we've built together." Her appeal to family unity would have been more convincing if she hadn't spent 2 years making it clear that I was never truly part of that family. "What exactly have we built together, Victoria?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Because from where I've been sitting, you've built a system where I'm tolerated at best, and excluded whenever possible. You've built traditions that center around my absence, rather than my inclusion. You've built a narrative where I'm the problem that needs to be managed, rather than a person whose feelings matter." Thomas shifted in his chair, probably uncomfortable with the intensity of the conversation, but professionally bound to remain present. I appreciated his discomfort because it reminded me that normal people found this level of family dysfunction disturbing. I'd been living with it so long that I'd started to accept it as inevitable. "The truth is," I continued, "I don't think any of you actually like me very much. I think you tolerate me because I'm married to Marcus, but if that weren't the case, you wouldn't choose to spend time with me or value my company." And that's fine, actually. People don't have to like everyone. But you can't build a functional family dynamic around barely concealed contempt and expect the target of that contempt to pretend everything is wonderful. Jennifer was starting to cry, though I couldn't tell if the tears were genuine emotion or strategic manipulation. Diana, that's not true. We don't dislike you. We just don't know how to relate to you sometimes. You're so different from the women we usually socialize with. Her words were probably meant as an explanation, but they only reinforced my point about being seen as fundamentally other. Different how? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, glancing at her mother for guidance before responding. Well, you know. Your background, your interests, your priorities. You're more serious than we're used to, more focused on work than social activities. It's not bad, it's just different. The coded language was transparent enough that even she seemed to recognize how it sounded. What she was really saying was that I was too ethnic, too ambitious, too intellectual for their comfort. I represented values and priorities that challenged their assumptions about what women should be and want. So the solution was to make me feel unwelcome until I learned to minimize those differences? I asked, to teach me that my natural personality was inappropriate for family gatherings. Jennifer's tears increased, but she didn't answer, probably recognizing that any response would only make things worse. Marcus suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone jump. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "We're sitting here acting like we're terrible people when all we did was try to include Diana in our family traditions. Maybe we made some mistakes, but we're not criminals. We're not abusers. We're just a normal family trying to navigate a complicated situation." His outburst revealed the defensive anger I'd been expecting, the resistance to accepting responsibility that would make any real change impossible. He was already rewriting the evening's events, transforming deliberate exclusion into unfortunate mistakes and systematic mistreatment into normal family complications. A normal family, I repeated slowly, doesn't force one member to eat alone in a kitchen while the others celebrate at the main table. A normal family doesn't spend 2 years making someone feel like an unwelcome outsider in her own marriage. A normal family doesn't require one person to completely change her personality to be tolerated by the others. "You're being dramatic," Marcus shot back, his composure finally cracking completely. "Nobody forced you to do anything. You chose to go along with Mom's suggestions because deep down you knew they made sense. You chose to change your behavior because you realized your original approach wasn't working. These were your decisions, Diana." The gaslighting was so complete and confident that I felt a momentary disorientation, a brief return to the self-doubt that had characterized so much of our marriage. But this time I had witnesses and evidence, objective observers who could confirm that his version of events didn't match reality. "Thomas," I said without taking my eyes off Marcus, "you witnessed what happened earlier tonight. Did I choose to eat in the kitchen, or was I directed there against my stated preference to sit with my husband's family?" Thomas straightened in his chair, clearly uncomfortable but professionally obligated to respond honestly. "From my observation, ma'am, you were directed to alternative seating despite expressing a desire to remain with your party." The arrangement appeared to be imposed rather than requested. His careful professional language carried more weight than any emotional appeal I could have made. Marcus's face flushed red as he realized his attempt to rewrite recent history had been contradicted by a neutral witness. "That's not how it happened," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Diana agreed to the arrangement. She understood why it made sense. "I agreed because I had no choice," I corrected. "I agreed because the alternative was causing a scene that would have embarrassed you and reflected poorly on your family. I agreed because I've spent 2 years learning that fighting for my own dignity is considered inappropriate behavior in your family's social system." Victoria was looking increasingly desperate, her carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture under the weight of having her behavior examined so directly. "Diana, you're making this sound much more calculated than it actually was. These were just spontaneous decisions made in the moment. Not some elaborate conspiracy to hurt your feelings. Spontaneous decisions that consistently worked against my interests and in favor of your comfort, I replied. Spontaneous decisions that somehow always resulted in my exclusion and your satisfaction. Spontaneous decisions that followed the same pattern for 2 years running. The mathematical precision of their casual cruelty was becoming impossible to deny. Richard cleared his throat, apparently deciding to try a different approach. Diana, let's assume for the sake of argument that we've all made mistakes in how we've treated you. What would it take to repair this situation and move forward as a family? His question sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could hear the underlying assumption that forgiveness and reconciliation were inevitable outcomes that just required the right negotiation. I don't think it can be repaired, I said, the words coming out more definitively than I'd expected. I don't think you can undo 2 years of systematic dismissal and contempt with apologies and promises to do better. I don't think you can rebuild trust that was never actually established in the first place. The finality in my voice seemed to shock them all, as if they'd assumed this was a negotiation rather than a declaration. Marcus sat back down heavily, his face pale with what might have been genuine recognition of what he was about to lose. Diana, you can't mean that. We can work this out. We're family. Are we? I asked, genuinely curious about his definition of that word. Because family members don't treat each other the way you've treated me. Family members don't require one person to earn acceptance through submission and self-denial. Family members don't celebrate each other's absence or arrange for one person to be excluded from shared experiences. Jennifer was crying harder now, her careful makeup running in dark streams down her cheeks. Diana, please don't break up our family over this. Think about what you're doing to Marcus, to all of us. Think about what you're throwing away. Her appeal was pure emotional manipulation, designed to make me responsible for the consequences of their own behavior. I'm not breaking up anything, I replied calmly. I'm just refusing to continue participating in a dynamic that requires me to accept mistreatment as the price of inclusion. If that breaks up the family, then the family was already broken. I'm just the first person to acknowledge it. Thomas was taking notes now, probably documenting the conversation for legal or business purposes. His professional detachment felt reassuring in a room full of people whose emotions were spiraling beyond their control. At least someone was approaching this situation with rational analysis, rather than desperate attempts to preserve a status quo that had never actually worked. The real question, I continued, is what you're all going to do with this information. Are you going to recognize that your behavior toward me has been unacceptable and make genuine changes? Or are you going to double down on the narrative that I'm being unreasonable and dramatic? The choice I was offering them was stark but fair: genuine accountability or continued delusion. Victoria was the first to respond, her voice shaky but determined. Diana, if we've hurt your feelings, we're sorry. We never intended to make you feel unwelcome or excluded. Perhaps we could arrange some family counseling to help us all communicate better. Her apology was carefully constructed to minimize responsibility while appearing reasonable and conciliatory. You're still doing it, I said, feeling tired rather than angry now. You're still framing this as a communication problem rather than a behavior problem. You're still acting like good intentions excuse harmful actions. You're still trying to make this my problem to solve rather than your problem to acknowledge. Marcus leaned forward, his expression desperate now. What do you want us to do, Diana? What would convince you that we're serious about changing? His question might have been sincere, but it revealed his continued failure to understand the fundamental issue. He was still thinking about this as a problem that could be solved with the right combination of words and gestures. I want you to stop asking what I want you to do and start figuring out what you think you should do, I replied. I want you to examine your own behavior and draw your own conclusions about whether it's been acceptable. I want you to take responsibility for your actions without being prompted or guided through the process by the person you've harmed. The request was apparently too much for them to process, judging by their blank expressions and uncomfortable silence. They'd spent so long operating from a position of assumed superiority that the idea of genuine self-reflection seemed foreign and threatening. Thomas looked up from his notepad, his expression professionally neutral but somehow sympathetic. Miss Chen, if you'd like to continue this conversation at another time or in a different setting, I'm happy to arrange alternative accommodations. This dining room will remain available for as long as you need it. His offer gave me an escape route if the conversation became too overwhelming, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Something about this confrontation felt unfinished, as if there were deeper truths that needed to be excavated before I could make any decisions about the future. Actually, Thomas, I think we need to address one more aspect of tonight's situation. You see, this family didn't just treat me poorly in your restaurant. They specifically chose your restaurant for their celebration, knowing that I would be excluded from it. The implication hung in the air as Thomas processed what I was saying. You mean they selected this establishment specifically because they knew you owned it? He asked, his professional composure slipping slightly. They brought you here knowing they intended to humiliate you in your own business? Oh no, I said, feeling a grim sort of amusement at the misunderstanding. They had no idea I owned this place. That was the beautiful irony of the evening. They chose the Crystal Palace because it represented everything they thought they were, and I wasn't. Expensive, exclusive, sophisticated. They brought me here to put me in my place, not knowing that this was actually my place. The revelation added another layer to the evening's events that none of them had considered. They hadn't just excluded me from a family celebration, they'd done it in a venue that belonged entirely to me, using my own business as a tool for my humiliation. The cosmic justice of the situation was almost too perfect to be believable. Marcus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, some combination of awe and horror at the woman he'd married without ever bothering to know. How long have you been planning this? He asked quietly. How long have you been waiting for the right moment to reveal all this? I wasn't planning anything, I replied honestly. I didn't know you were going to exile me to the kitchen tonight. I didn't know your family was going to treat me so badly that I'd finally reach my breaking point. This whole evening has been improvised, a response to circumstances I never anticipated. The spontaneous nature of my revenge made it feel more pure somehow, uncontaminated by long-term scheming or calculated manipulation. But the restaurant purchase, Jennifer said through her tears, that must have been planned. You must have known this would give you power over us. Her assumption that everything I did was motivated by thoughts of them was both flattering and insulting, revealing how completely they'd misunderstood my priorities and motivations. I bought this restaurant chain because it was a good investment opportunity that aligned with my professional interests. I explained patiently. Your family's opinion of me, your social preferences, your potential reactions never entered into the decision-making process. The world doesn't actually revolve around managing your comfort and expectations. The statement seemed to genuinely shock them, as if the idea that I might make major life decisions without considering their interests was revolutionary. But it revealed something important about how they viewed our relationship. They'd assumed I existed primarily in relation to them, that my choices and actions were always somehow about them. Richard was studying me with new attention, probably trying to reconcile the submissive woman he thought he knew with the strategic businesswoman who had just been revealed. Diana, I have to admit I've underestimated you significantly. Your business acumen is clearly more sophisticated than any of us realized. His admission was probably meant as a compliment, but it only highlighted how completely they'd dismissed my capabilities for 2 years. You underestimated me because you never bothered to look, I replied. You decided what kind of person I was based on superficial characteristics, and never updated your assessment, despite years of evidence to the contrary. You saw what you expected to see rather than what was actually there. Victoria was wringing her hands now, her composure completely shattered. Diana, please tell us how to fix this. Tell us what we need to do to make things right between us. We're willing to do whatever it takes. Her desperation was palpable, but it was motivated by fear of consequences rather than genuine remorse about her behavior. I don't think it can be fixed, I said, the truth of the statement settling over me like a blanket. I don't think you can rebuild a relationship that was built on false premises from the beginning. I don't think you can create genuine acceptance and respect when the foundation has always been conditional tolerance and barely concealed contempt. Marcus was shaking his head, refusing to accept what I was saying. Diana, you're being too absolute about this. People change, Relationships evolve. We can learn from our mistakes and do better going forward. But his words felt hollow, automatic responses, rather than genuine understanding. Can you? I asked. Can you really change beliefs and attitudes that have been consistent for years? Can you suddenly start seeing me as an equal when you've spent so long viewing me as a burden to be managed? Can you develop genuine respect and affection for someone you've never actually tried to know? The questions hung in the air without answers because we all knew what the answers were. People could change, but only if they recognized the need for change and were willing to do the difficult work of examining and challenging their own assumptions. Nothing I'd heard tonight suggested that kind of deep self-reflection was likely or even possible. Thomas cleared his throat again, glancing at his watch. Ms. Chen, I don't want to interrupt, but I should mention that the restaurant will be closing soon, and the main dining room staff needs to complete their closing procedures. His reminder brought me back to the practical realities of the situation, the fact that this confrontation was happening in a business establishment with its own schedules and requirements. Of course, I said, standing up for the first time since entering the room. I think we've covered the essential points anyway. The movement felt symbolic somehow, a physical representation of my decision to stop participating in conversations that were going nowhere. Diana, wait, Marcus said, rising quickly to follow me. We can't end things like this. We need more time to work through everything that's been said tonight. But I could hear the desperation in his voice. The panic of someone realizing he was about to lose something he'd never bothered to value properly. Actually, Marcus, I think we've had more than enough time, I replied, moving toward the door. We've had 2 years to work through these issues, and tonight's events prove that nothing has improved. If anything, the problem has gotten worse over time, rather than better. Jennifer jumped up from her chair, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Diana, please don't leave like this. Think about what you're doing to our family, to Marcus's career, to everything we've all worked to build together. Her appeal was pure emotional manipulation, designed to make me responsible for consequences I hadn't created. I haven't worked to build any of this, I replied, gesturing around the elegant dining room. I've worked to survive it, to find ways to exist within a system that was never designed to include me. But I'm done with that now. I'm done trying to fit into spaces where I'm not wanted. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Diana, you're a part of this family whether you like it or not. You can't just walk away from 2 years of marriage and shared experiences because of one difficult evening. But her words only proved how little she understood about what had actually been shared and what had merely been endured. Watch me, I said simply, opening the door and stepping into the hallway that led back to the main restaurant. The symbolic weight of the action felt appropriate, a physical representation of my decision to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of chairs scraping and urgent whispered conversations as the family processed what had just happened and tried to figure out their next move. But their reactions no longer felt like my responsibility to manage or consider. For the first time in 2 years, I was making decisions based on my own needs and preferences rather than their comfort and convenience. The walk through the restaurant felt different now, purposeful rather than defeated. Other diners glanced up as I passed, probably wondering about the intense conversation that had been taking place in the private dining room. But their curiosity felt benign compared to the judgment and dismissal I'd grown accustomed to from people who were supposed to care about me. When I reached the main entrance, I paused to look back at the restaurant one more time. The Crystal Palace had always represented everything I thought I wanted. Elegance, sophistication, the kind of social acceptance that seemed to matter so much to the Whitman family. But owning it hadn't made me feel powerful or successful. It had just provided me with the means to expose the true nature of people I'd been trying desperately to please. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent a fortune acquiring a business that would primarily serve as the setting for the destruction of my marriage and the end of my relationship with the only family I'd had for 2 years. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps some prices were worth paying for the clarity that came with finally seeing the truth about who people really were when they thought no one important was watching. The morning after the confrontation at Crystal Palace, I woke up in my downtown apartment for the first time in 6 months. I'd maintained the lease even after moving in with Marcus, some instinct telling me to keep an escape route available. Now, surrounded by my own furniture, and the quiet that came with solitude, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in years. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left the restaurant, messages from Marcus alternating between angry demands and desperate apologies. Victoria had sent several lengthy texts, explaining how I'd misunderstood their intentions. Jennifer had left voicemails promising that things could be different if I'd just give them another chance. I deleted them all without reading or listening completely. The business of untangling a marriage proved more complex than orchestrating revenge at a dinner party. My lawyer, Patricia Wong, had been handling my restaurant acquisition and was unsurprised by my request to discuss divorce proceedings. She'd seen the prenuptial agreement Marcus had insisted upon, designed to protect his family's assets from someone they'd assumed was marrying for money. "The irony is beautiful," Patricia said, reviewing the documents in her office that afternoon. "This prenup actually works in your favor now. They wanted to ensure you couldn't claim any of their assets, but it also means they can't claim any of yours. Your restaurant chain, your investments, your property acquisitions over the past 2 years, all of it remains entirely yours." The Whitman family's assumptions about my motivations had led them to create legal protections that now shielded my actual wealth from their potential claims. Marcus would get nothing from our divorce except the realization that he'd married someone far more successful than he'd ever bothered to discover. "There's something else you should know," Patricia continued, pulling out another folder. "I've been monitoring some unusual activity related to your husband's family business. It appears they've been operating under some financial stress that they've managed to keep quiet." She spread several documents across her desk, bank records and credit reports that painted a picture of a family living beyond their means. The Whitman wealth, it turned out, was largely smoke and mirrors. Richard's business had been struggling for years, sustained by loans secured against properties that were rapidly losing value. Victoria's shopping habits had been funded by credit cards that were approaching their limits. Even Marcus's promotion, the achievement we'd supposedly been celebrating, came with a salary that barely covered their existing obligations. "They need money, Diana," Patricia said bluntly. "And they probably thought your restaurant ownership might be their salvation, a family business they could somehow benefit from or control." The revelation reframed the entire confrontation from the previous evening. Their desperate attempts to reconcile weren't motivated by love or genuine remorse. They were motivated by financial necessity disguised as family loyalty. My phone rang as Patricia was explaining the legal timeline for divorce proceedings. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Diana, thank God." His voice was strained, exhausted. "We need to talk. There are things you don't understand about our situation, about why last night happened the way it did." "I understand perfectly," I replied calmly. "I understand that your family needed someone to blame for their financial problems, and I was a convenient target. I understand that treating me poorly made you all feel better about your own circumstances. I understand that my success threatens the narrative you've built about yourselves." There was a long pause before he responded. "It's not that simple, Diana. Yes, we've had some challenges, but that doesn't mean our feelings about you aren't genuine. We want to work this out, as a family." The word family still carried the weight of obligation in his mind, as if invoking it would somehow compel my cooperation. "Your family had 2 years to work things out," I said. "Instead, you spent that time making me smaller so you could feel larger. You spent it teaching me to accept mistreatment as the price of inclusion. You spent it convincing me that my achievements were embarrassments rather than assets." Patricia was taking notes, probably documenting his admission that the family had been facing challenges they'd hidden from me. "Diana, please." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "Don't throw away everything we have over one difficult evening. Don't punish all of us for mistakes that can be corrected." But his plea revealed how little he understood about what we actually had. In his mind, we had a marriage worth saving. In my mind, we had 2 years of evidence that marriage had never really existed. "I'm not throwing anything away," I told him. I'm just stopping my participation in something that was never working. I'm choosing my own well-being over your family's comfort for the first time since I've known you." I ended the call without waiting for his response, feeling lighter with each boundary I established. Patricia smiled approvingly. "That conversation will be helpful in court if they try to claim emotional distress or argue that the divorce is somehow punitive rather than necessary." She handed me a business card. "I'm also recommending you speak with a financial advisor about protecting your assets. Desperate people sometimes make desperate choices, and the Whitmans are facing some serious financial pressures." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork and business meetings. I threw myself into expanding the restaurant chain, using the crisis of my marriage as motivation to build something even more successful. The work felt therapeutic, a return to the confidence and competence I'd abandoned in my futile attempts to gain acceptance from people who were determined to withhold it. Crystal Palace's business actually improved after that evening. Word had somehow gotten out about a dramatic family confrontation in the private dining room, and the mystery surrounding the incident had generated buzz that translated into reservations. Thomas reported that people were specifically requesting the room where something interesting had happened, turning my personal crisis into a marketing opportunity. I decided to visit the restaurant one evening, curious to see how the staff was handling the increased attention. Rosa greeted me at the kitchen entrance with a knowing smile. "I heard you're the owner now," she said. "I also heard you handled that family situation with more class than they deserved." Word travels fast in the restaurant industry, and apparently my story had become legend among the service staff. "How are they handling the new business?" I asked, gesturing toward the busy dining room. Rosa's smile broadened. "Let's just say that night taught everyone here something about treating people with respect, regardless of what you think their status is. The service has been exceptional ever since. Sometimes the best lessons were learned through public examples rather than private conversations." I was reviewing financial reports in the manager's office when Thomas knocked on the door. "Miss Chen, there's a situation I thought you should know about. Mrs. Victoria Whitman is here, requesting to speak with you." The irony of Victoria seeking me out at the same restaurant where she'd banished me to the kitchen just weeks earlier wasn't lost on either of us. "Show her to the private dining room," I said after a moment's consideration. "And Thomas, I want you present for this conversation as well. Consider it a continuation of your education in customer service policies." If Victoria wanted another confrontation, she would have it under circumstances that favored transparency rather than manipulation. When I entered the private dining room, Victoria was seated at the same table where our family confrontation had taken place. She looked smaller somehow, her usual commanding presence diminished by circumstances she couldn't control. Her designer clothes still looked expensive, but they hung on her frame like costumes rather than expressions of genuine confidence. "Diana," she said, attempting to summon her old authoritative tone, "I appreciate you agreeing to see me. I think we need to clear the air about what happened here and find a way to move forward that benefits everyone involved." Even in her diminished state, she was still trying to control the narrative and frame the conversation in terms that assumed my cooperation. "I'm not interested in moving forward with you, Victoria," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "I'm interested in moving forward without you, which is exactly what I've been doing since that evening." Thomas positioned himself near the door, his notebook ready to document whatever was about to unfold. Victoria's composure slipped slightly, revealing the desperation underneath her carefully maintained facade. "Diana, I know we've had our difficulties, but we're still family. Marcus is still your husband, and I'm still your mother-in-law. We have obligations to each other that transcend temporary disagreements." Her appeal to family obligations would have been more convincing if she'd honored those obligations herself. "Actually, Victoria, we don't have obligations to each other," I corrected. "You've made it clear for 2 years that I'm not really part of your family, that my inclusion is conditional and my acceptance is temporary. You can't invoke family loyalty when it suits your purposes after systematically demonstrating that loyalty doesn't extend to me." She leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she'd probably perfected in decades of social manipulation. Diana, I'm willing to admit that we haven't always handled things perfectly. Perhaps we could have been more welcoming, more inclusive in our family activities. But surely we can learn from our mistakes and build something better going forward. The mistake wasn't in the handling, I said firmly. The mistake was in the fundamental attitude that made the handling necessary. You didn't accidentally exclude me or accidentally treat me as inferior. You did those things deliberately because you believed I deserved that treatment. Thomas was taking detailed notes, creating a record of admissions that might prove useful later. Victoria's mask was slipping more obviously now, stress fractures showing in her composed expression. Diana, you have to understand our position. When Marcus brought you home, we didn't know what to make of you. You were so different from what we expected, so focused on work and achievement instead of the social aspects of marriage. Her explanation revealed the prejudices that had driven her behavior all along. So you decided to fix me, I said, understanding finally clicking into place. You decided to teach me how to be the kind of woman you thought Marcus should have married. You decided to reshape me into someone more acceptable to your social circle. The systematic nature of their treatment had been a correction project, an attempt to modify my personality and priorities to better fit their preferences. We wanted to help you integrate, Victoria said defensively. We wanted to give you the tools you needed to be successful in our world. But her words only confirmed that their world required me to abandon everything that made me who I was in exchange for conditional acceptance. Your world? I repeated slowly. A world where success is measured by how well you hide your actual capabilities so others don't feel threatened. A world where intelligence and ambition are character flaws that need to be managed. A world where acceptance is earned through submission and self-denial. The contempt in my voice was unmistakable. Victoria's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the anger and resentment that had always lurked beneath her polite dismissals. Your world isn't better, Diana. Your world is cold and calculating and focused on things that don't matter. You built a business empire, but you couldn't build a marriage that lasted 2 years. You accumulated wealth, but you couldn't earn the respect of the people closest to you. The people closest to me never offered their respect, I replied calmly. They offered conditional tolerance in exchange for my complete submission to their preferences and prejudices. They offered inclusion as a reward for making myself smaller and less threatening to their egos. Thomas looked up from his notes, clearly recognizing the significance of Victoria's admissions. We offered you a place in our family, Victoria insisted, but her voice lacked conviction now. We offered you traditions and connections and social advantages that you never would have had access to otherwise. Her words revealed how completely she misunderstood what I'd actually wanted from the relationship. I didn't want access to your social advantages, I said. I wanted to be valued for who I was rather than tolerated for who I might become if I changed enough. I wanted my achievements to be celebrated rather than hidden. I wanted my opinions to matter in conversations about my own life. The simplicity of these desires made their denial even more cruel. Victoria was silent for a long moment, apparently processing the reality that her manipulation tactics weren't working. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat with defeat. What do you want, Diana? What will it take for you to consider reconciliation with Marcus and our family? Her question assumed that everything had a price, that the right combination of concessions could restore the status quo. I want you to understand that some things can't be fixed with negotiations, I replied. I want you to recognize that some damage is permanent once it's been done. I want you to accept that your treatment of me wasn't a series of mistakes, but a reflection of values and attitudes that are fundamentally incompatible with respect and equality. The conversation continued for another hour, but it was essentially over. Victoria had come hoping to find a way to restore the family dynamic that had served her so well, but she left understanding that the woman she'd spent 2 years diminishing was gone forever. In her place was someone who valued herself enough to reject treatment that fell short of basic human dignity. 6 months later, my divorce from Marcus was finalized with surprising efficiency. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon protected my assets completely, while leaving him with nothing but the realization that he'd married and lost someone far more valuable than he'd ever bothered to discover. The Whitman family's financial problems became public knowledge when Richard's business filed for bankruptcy, making their desperate attempts at reconciliation with me look even more calculating in retrospect. Crystal Palace continued to thrive under my ownership, becoming a symbol of success built through competence rather than social connections. I expanded the chain to 12 locations, each one a testament to the value of authentic achievement over inherited privilege. The private dining room where our confrontation had taken place became my favorite spot for business meetings, a reminder of what happened when people underestimated the consequences of their cruelty. Sometimes former staff members would ask me about that night, curious about the family drama that had become restaurant folklore. I would tell them that it was the evening I learned the difference between being included and being accepted, between being tolerated and being valued, between trying to fit into someone else's world and building a world of my own. The woman who had eaten alone in the kitchen while her husband's family celebrated at the best table was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most important table was the one where you were genuinely welcomed rather than grudgingly accommodated. That understanding had cost me a marriage, but it had given me back myself, and that exchange had proven to be the best business decision I'd ever made. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.